Great, awesome. So I'm going to do that and make sure that I am able to. So does everyone see that okay? You can see the Confluence logo.
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Which is 7 imperfect circles crossing each other in multiple confluences, and it symbolizes the 7 generations, the 7 cardinal directions, which are north, south, east, west, up and down and inside, and also the 7 sites, 6 on land, 6 confluence sites on land, and 1 online, if you're curious about the logo itself. And as Mary said, I came to Confluence as a storyteller, and throughout my time as a reporter and then as a regional editor in public radio, I was always drawn to stories about history, and specifically the history that surrounds us that very few people know about. And so if you have a keen knowledge of the Columbia River, you might know this spot, which is Lake Celilo, where Celilo Falls once roared. And I'll talk a little bit about Celilo Park in our project there, but this to me was the most powerful story about the Columbia River, this center of commerce, center of spiritual life, center of fishing. They called it the Wall Street of the West, easily the most important economically and culturally place in the Pacific Northwest for 16,000 years. And when you think about our own history, 200 years since Lewis and Clark and 500 or so years since Columbus, but we're talking 16,000 years. And in 1957, actually the anniversary was just last week, March 10th, the Dalles Dam closed and flooded Celilo Falls. And it just always really struck me that so few people know about it, right? It's just a story. And whether, you know, no matter how you feel about it, it's a story that in part defines our region. So the mission of Confluence is to connect people with the history, living cultures, and ecology of the Columbia River system through indigenous voices. And the project began with this man, Antone Minthorn, who at the time in the early 2000s was the head of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And he felt very strongly, there were a lot of tribal communities that didn't want to have anything to do with the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, which was coming up. But Antone felt very strongly that the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial represented an opportunity to overturn myths that somehow Lewis and Clark discovered this place, but also to remind people that, you know, tribes have been here and they're still here. He had an economic story to tell about the success of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and he wanted to make sure that people understood it. And he saw the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial as an opportunity to tell that story. And our founding director, Jane Jacobson, who was a real force of nature and an extraordinary human who sadly passed away suddenly last year, she felt very strongly that art built into the landscape needed to be part of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, that symposiums are great, conferences are great, you know, books are great, that's all wonderful, but she felt that the history of this place from an indigenous perspective needed to be written into the landscape itself. So independently on their own, Antone and Jane came up with the idea of approaching this woman, Maya Lin, who is a world-renowned artist, best known for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And since I grew up in Ohio, I have to point out that she grew up in Athens, Ohio, the child of 2 Ohio University professors. And Maya wasn't the least bit interested in commemorating or celebrating Lewis and Clark. But what she was interested in is connecting people with the cultural story of the Columbia River, and also the ecological story of the Columbia River. And, you know, Maya is an environmentalist, and she feels very strongly that her artwork should invite people. You know, her style is not to hammer you over the head. It's not a big sculpture that sort of lands in the middle of the landscape. Her artwork is called minimalist, and it's an invitation to look at the landscape around you in a different way. And so she felt that Confluence was an opportunity to do that and to tell a different story about the Columbia River and its people, but also about its ecology. And the way she puts it is, you know, her art is not meant to, she can't compete with the Columbia River, right? The art is not about representing the Columbia River. The art is about framing the landscape in a different way and inviting us all to look at it a little differently. So What ensued, beginning in 2002, we're celebrating our 20th year as an organization, is a series of meetings and consultations with tribes, with historians, a lot of research, and a lot of discussions with communities. And the long story short is that Confluence and Maya and tribes came up with 7 sites. One site, I can talk a little bit about this, has kind of dropped off the radar for a bit, but it may come back. But 6 sites on land, beginning in Chinook homelands on the left-hand side of your screen at Cape Disappointment State Park near the mouth of the Columbia River, and going all the way to Nez Perce homelands in eastern Washington, near where the Snake and the Clearwater River come together, and that's the listening circle at Chief Timothy Park. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of these sites. I'll go relatively quickly and to be able to leave room for discussions. But I do want to mention one thing, like how are these sites chosen? And as the discussions ensued, one of the questions that kept coming up is, okay, we know the important places for Lewis and Clark. What are, the important moments in the journal and their journey? What are the important places for tribes? And they tended to be confluences because rivers were the super highways of their day, right? So this confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia, the confluence of the Snake River and the Columbia, the confluence of the Sandy River. These are where rivers come together, and they tended to be where people came together too, where Lewis and Clark documented villages and places of commerce. But it also became a metaphor, because if the story we've been telling for generations, for 200 years, about Lewis and Clark and ourselves is fundamentally about discovery, right? It was the Lewis and Clark core of discovery. And we've been talking about how all these explorers discovered America. We all know that's not true, right? None of us believes that. They didn't discover, they documented, they visited, but they didn't discover this place. We know that people have been here for at least 16,000 years and probably longer. But if the story about this place is not discovery, what is it? It's about confluence. It's about people coming together. It's about cultures coming together, languages, histories coming together, for better or for worse. And that ultimately is what the artwork is about, what the organization is about, what our mission is about, and our education program that I'll talk about. So Cape Disappointment is the worst named state park in America. I promise it is not a disappointing place to go. And it is a series of artworks designed to really connect you with the fishing that has gone on there, with the Chinook cultures, and to remind you of the native people that have been there and continue to be there. The Confluence Land Bridge at Fort Vancouver is just now getting a big refurbishment. The walkway has been repaved, and we're going to do a new rededication ceremony on April 22nd at 10:30 a.m. at the People Overlook. This is the only Confluence site that was not designed by Maya Lin. Instead, it was designed by architect John Paul Jones, and it is an earthen walkway over the freeway to reconnect the community of Vancouver with the waterfront, which is why Vancouver became a place. A city in the first place, and it was a trading area long before the Hudson's Bay Company located there in the 1820s. So the Confluence bird blind, I hope many of you have been at the U.S. Forest Service land at the Sandy River Delta. The bird blind is at the confluence of the Sandy and the Columbia Rivers, but it's sort of the old and new confluence. The Army Corps of Engineers in 2013 ripped out a dam that had blocked off a channel of the Sandy River. And this is a massive, one of the most nationally one of the most significant regeneration projects. I think I would use that term. It's there's tree plantings, and there's lots of efforts to bring this 1,000-acre park, misnamed because it's actually about 1,500 acres, back to its quote unquote natural state, but a healthy riparian area. And Maya wanted to locate a work of art there to really celebrate those efforts and also create something hopeful about the future. So the Confluence story circles, I should say, are at the confluence of the Snake and Columbia Rivers in Pasco, Washington. And they're a series of story circles built into the landscape to remind people of the stories of Native people. And the listening circle at Chief Timothy Park in Nez Perce homelands, we had a dedication ceremony there in 2015 with Nez Perce horse riders and drummers. was a beautiful experience. And that project is designed to honor the Nimipu, the Nez Perce people, and to remind people of whose landscape they're in. So Celilo Falls, I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, and the artwork planned, this is the only project that is not yet complete, for Celilo Park near the Dalles, you can see what it looks like now, is an elevated walkway inspired by the traditional fishing platforms that you would have seen there. The three purposes of this project are to educate people about Celilo Falls, to honor the indigenous people of the Columbia River, and to strengthen the tribal presence in the public spaces on the river, to bring tribal members to these public spaces and welcoming places, to remind people that these are tribal areas, these are indigenous places and significant in indigenous cultures. This project is on hold because we have support from three Columbia River tribes, the Warm Springs, the Umatilla, and the Nez Perce tribe. But the Yakima Nation had supported the project, but in 2018, they rescinded that support. They don't want anything to happen there. They want the park actually to be decommissioned. So there's a disagreement among the tribes, and that put us in a position to decide whether we should go forward or not. And the tribes that support the project said, well, we still support it and we want you to continue to advocate for it, but why don't you focus instead on education, because everybody likes that. So that is what we've been doing. So Confluence in the Classroom is an effort to bring indigenous artists and educators into schools to share their perspective on their own terms, and to bring the voices of Native people into places that they haven't traditionally been welcome. And this is Linda Mianis, who grew up at Celilo Falls and was a subject of a book in 1956 called Linda's Indian Home. There she is in White Salmon, Washington, teaching kids about the history of Celilo Falls. Confluence Outdoors is the field trip version of the same thing. We connect kids with artists and educators like Bridget McConville, who's a Warm Springs fisherpreneur, I like to call her, but also an artist and a tradition keeper. These pictures are, of course, pre-COVID, but the field trips are starting up again this spring, and so we're super excited about that. Over the years, teachers have invited us, again, these pictures are pre-COVID. What we've heard from teachers is that they need help and they need support to be able to appropriately bring these voices into their classroom. And most teachers are not Native, and so we need them as allies, but they need to know a lot more about Native history and Native culture. And tribes have invited us to do this, and it is only because of that that we've moved toward teacher development. Confluence in the Community is a series of community events, as we say, designed to elevate indigenous voices in our understanding of the Columbia River. We'll come up with a theme maybe, and we'll give prompts for people to respond to, but again, it is Native people sharing their stories and their perspective on their own terms. We do a series of volunteer work parties at all of our sites because public art needs care. And once again, during the pandemic, this took a back seat and we didn't have a whole lot of this, but we just had a series of 2 work parties. I should put new pictures in here because we were just at the Bird Blind 2 weekends in a row, and it was really fabulous to get back out there. Confluence Online is the third element of our education initiatives, and it's a series of photo galleries, as you see here, but also interviews and documentary shorts and research papers. We're actually starting a journal that will take research papers that would normally go into the library and put them in print form. And again, these are Native voices. And because there are many elders who are not going to be with us for long, and because there are just not enough Native educators to get into schools, we have to record them, and we record them with a high production value so that teachers can use them and can share them, and people and anyone who is curious to know more about the Columbia River system. One of the things we find is that once you begin down a road, we talk about entry points on the road toward a more inclusive understanding of our landscape, that once you start going down this road, it's hard to stop, and you always learn something new. And so particularly for this audience, I do want to mention, I'm going to get out of here, one of the things that we have started in the last few years, if you think about our education programs and our professional development programs and our online resources, we came up with a program that we call Confluence Field School. And it is a series of in-depth discussions over a month or so with a select cohort, although I don't like that term because it seems too academic, but a group of people who get together to really kind of learn this stuff. And we have found great interest among federal and state agencies that focus on land management, and also environmental groups that do conservation and do conservation education. We've seen what you might consider a great awakening, and I'm sure there are people on this call who have experienced this too. A great awakening about the need to include indigenous perspectives in land management decisions and how we care for this place, because they did it for 16,000 years. And so there are lessons to learn from them. And again, you know, we don't have a checkpoint system or bullet points of like, here, do this, this, and this, and this. What we've really learned is that it's about building relationships. And field school is a really great way to build relationships, but also to really listen to Native people together and consider ways that that indigenous perspectives and traditional ecological knowledge can be used in the landscape. So with that, I will just end and open it up for questions. Thank you for listening.